Chapter 2. The Rulers and the Ruled. Gaetano Mosca's The Ruling Class was first published as Elementi di Scienza Politica in 1895, he then revised and massively expanded it in 1923. It was translated into English in 1939 and retitled The Ruling Class. Mosca, then at the age of 80, gave his blessing to this version, which was based on the second edition. I am starting with Mosca not only because this book comes first chronologically, but also because he provides us with the most basic conceptual units in our analysis of power and politics. He has two main theses in The Ruling Class: first, the rulers and the ruled, and second, political formulas. To these we can add two subtheses, the two strata of the ruling class and level of civilization and juridical defense. For the remainder of this chapter, let us deal with each of these in turn. First, Mosca's central thesis, for which he is most famous, is the fact that human societies are always governed by minorities. He says, among the constant facts and tendencies that are to be found in all political organisms, one is so obvious that it is apparent to the most casual eye. In all societies, from all societies that are very meagerly developed and have barely attained the dawnings of civilization, down to the most advanced and powerful societies, two classes of people appear, a class that rules and a class that is ruled. As Mosca says, this much seems obvious, so why must this be pointed out and insisted upon quite so emphatically? It is because Mosca rejected any notion of popular sovereignty. Since there are always the rulers and the ruled, how can the people ever be sovereign? Power does not rest nor will ever rest in either will of people, but rather in the organized efforts of the ruling minority. People in liberal or social democracies may tell themselves otherwise, but, as Mosca contends, in reality the dominion of an organized minority, obeying a single impulse, over the unorganized majority is inevitable. The power of any minority is irresistible as against each single individual in the majority, who stands alone before the totality of the organized minority. 100 men acting uniformly in concert, with a common understanding, will triumph over 1,000 men who are not in accord and can therefore be dealt with one by one. Meanwhile, it will be easier for the former to act in concert and have a mutual understanding simply because they are 100 and not 1,000. It follows that the larger the political community, the smaller will the proportion of the governing minority to the governed majority be, and the more difficult will it be for the majority to organize for reaction against the minority. We might call this a Mosca's law, and much of his study is devoted to demonstrating this theory in practice using examples from history, and in demystifying democratic claims which try to get around this by appealing to the will of the people and other such formulations. Even in the most charitable interpretation, representative democracy is simply elected oligarchy. It is worth stressing the point, as Geraint Parry does, that Mosca's thesis is more than simply saying that organized minorities always rule. The elitist thesis does not merely assert that in a society the minority makes the decisions and the majority obeys. This is an obvious truism with no power to explain political relationships. That fewer people issue laws, orders, and instructions than receive and obey them is a fact scarcely worth commenting upon. The elitist argument is a much stronger one. It is that the dominant minority cannot be controlled by the majority wherever democratic mechanisms are used. Where democracies are concerned, Mosca says that the assumption that the elected official is the mouthpiece of the majority of his electors is as a rule not consistent with the facts. What happens in other forms of government, namely, that an organized minority imposes its will on the disorganized majority, happens also and to perfection, whatever the appearances to the contrary, under the representative system. When we say that the voters choose their representative, we are using a language that is very inexact. The truth is that the representative has himself elected by the voters, and, if that phrase should seem too inflexible and too harsh to fit some cases, we might qualify it by saying that his friends have him elected. In elections, as in all other manifestations of social life, those who have the will and, especially, the moral, intellectual and material means to force their will upon others take the lead over the others and command them. Elsewhere, he points out that these friends of the elected representative tend to be wealthy people who can afford to pay him to represent their minority interests over and above the interests of the majority. Such wealthy people also have the resources necessary to control newspapers and other media, which in turn control the dissemination of information to the public and hence the formation of their individual opinions. In any case, in most cases, the alternative candidates for election will similarly have been preselected by elites, whose campaigns are managed by organized minorities, so that any result will favor their interests. There are two profound consequences of Mosca's law. First, because it is a permanent aspect of human society, the classical liberal notion that there is an antagonism between the state and society is rendered as utopian nonsense. From our point of view, there can be no antagonism between state and society. The state is to be looked upon merely as that part of society which performs the political function. Considered in this light, all questions touching interference or non-interference by the state come to assume a new aspect. Instead of asking what the limits of state activity ought to be, we try to find out what the best type of political organization is, which type, in other words, enables all the elements that have a political significance in a given society to be best utilized and specialized, best subjected to reciprocal control and to the principle of individual responsibility for the things that are done in the respective domains. Mosca's ultimate answer to this is a kind of Machiavellian mixed republic in which there are competing power centers and in which different social types are part of the process of power. Senators, for example, should not be elected but rather men of distinction and social standing in other fields who serve as a duty and without a wage. In this respect, his vision of a balanced system is not that far removed from the original vision of the American founding fathers. With that said, he is highly skeptical and critical of written constitutions, and prefers as his model the more organic British system in which the wisdom of the ruling class has facilitated change without violent revolution. However, Mosca's positive prescriptions are less important than his clear-eyed diagnosis of reality. Which brings us to the second consequence of Mosca's law. He is highly critical of Herbert Spencer's notion that there is any real distinction between military states founded on force and coercion and liberal states founded on voluntary association and trade. He argues, any political organization is both voluntary and coercive at one and the same time, voluntary because it arises from the very nature of man, as was long ago noted by Aristotle, and coercive because it is a necessary fact, the human being finding himself unable to live otherwise. It is natural, therefore, and at the same time indispensable, that where there are men there should automatically be a society, and that when there is a society there should also be a state, that is to say, a minority that rules and a majority that is ruled by the ruling minority. Thus, we must bear in mind that when Mosca is described as a liberal, it is not in the sense of being a small state classical liberal or what is today called a libertarian. He was liberal only in the sense that he opposed absolutism and generally supported separation of powers and their distribution across social types. We will return to this theme when we consider Carl Schmitt and Bertrand de Juvenal, who independently came to understand that separation of powers is a myth seldom, if ever, realized in practice. Now we must ask a question: why do the majority assent to the rule of the minority? According to Mosca, it is because they, at least tacitly, subscribe to the political formula of the ruling class. The political formula, or the principle of sovereignty, is defined as that legal and moral basis, or principle, on which the power of the political class rests. The two chief examples Mosca provides are those political formulas that are based on supernatural beliefs, for example, the divine right of kings, and those based on the notion of popular sovereignty or the will of the people. However, these myths are not necessarily to be taken as cynical lies told by the rulers to hoodwink the masses, but are necessary for the smooth operation of the whole society. Georges Sorel called them myths, Karl Mannheim, and later the Marxist, Louis Althusser, called them ideologies. Indeed, Mosca recognizes that immoral unities between the rulers and the ruled can create almost miraculous situations in which they may overcome materially stronger external powers in war. Today we might think of the Vietnamese against the Americans, or the Afghani Taliban against the Americans. Mosca's examples include the Spanish against the French in 1808 and various so-called barbarian groups, such as the Franks, against the Romans at the fall of their empire. However, it is not enough for the ruled majority alone to have this moral unity. They could show great courage, but will still likely fail if they are not met by an equal moral unity in the ruling class. Mosca gives the example of the Kingdom of Naples against the French in 1798-9, where the people were united, but they were betrayed by the pro-French sympathies of their ruling class. Treason, therefore, and, more than treason, the unending suspicion of treason paralyzed all resistance, disorganized the regular army, and diminished the effectiveness of a spontaneous popular resistance, which might have triumphed. The inverse is also true. A ruling class who show moral unity will likely fail if the ruled do not share their convictions. Again, we might think of American foreign escapades since World War II. No ruling class can survive without an effective political formula. Ruling classes may fail to adapt their formula to the changed demands of society, or ruling classes may renew themselves or be renewed. In the first case, failure to renew the formula may signal the end of the ruling class. In the second case, the formula might be retained. The British Crown would be a good example. A new ruling class can arise out of the peoples with a new political formula. The ruled mass remain the humus out of which grow leading groups. But if this is the case, and if a political formula can be so powerful as an animating spirit as to be in Mosca's own terms a quasi-miraculous, then why is he so adamant that the political formula of popular sovereignty should be demystified and debunked as factually fraudulent? First, remember that Mosca's goal was not to instruct rulers in the art of politics, but rather to outline a science of politics which sees things in the cold light of day. Second, Mosca saw the political formula of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, as being entirely destructive because it is impossible to put into practice. The democratic principle is simply one wrong-headed offshoot of this. Mosca points out that the will of the people and the notion of divine right are both, in practice, taken on faith and are beyond reason. But the will of the people, unlike divine right, is the product of Enlightenment rationalism and is demonstrably false. This falsity has practical and often violent consequences, which supernatural beliefs do not. Mosca argued that democracy was inherently bad, and that the desire to rectify these problems via reforms aimed at instituting true democracy were totally misconceived. They would only make matters worse. The cold reality that the people are not and can never be sovereign will continually rear its head, so it is quite ineffective as a source of moral unity. In other words, it acts as a constant source of class resentment so that the unity of ruler and ruled, which can be so powerful, never fully comes about. Mosca rejected any monistic view of history, that is a theory of history which holds that there is one single cause that accounts for everything that happens in society. The political formula is important, but it is not the sole driver in history. Hence, Mosca's theory of regime change, the replacement of one ruling class with another, is quite dynamic. He states, as soon as there is a shift in the balance of political forces, then the manner in which the ruling class is constituted changes also. If a new source of wealth develops in a society, if a practical importance of knowledge grows, if an old religion declines or a new one is born, if a new current of ideas spreads, then, simultaneously, far-reaching dislocations occur in the ruling class. This contrasts with Karl Marx, for whom the sole driver of history is always economic, and in contrast with Pareto, who, as we shall see in the next chapter, put the circulation of elites down to psychology. Mosca's conception may seem less neat in comparison, but as a student of history, he knew that history is often messy and complex, and does not fit easily into any abstract scheme. He rejected the single-factor fallacy. For him, the prime movers in history were disturbances to social forces, which can be brought about through changes in economic conditions or technology, or brought about by new ideas. By social forces, H. Stuart Hughes explains, he meant the major public interests constituted by businessmen and agriculturalists, intellectuals, and the military. The ruling class must adapt to the new conditions, or else they will be replaced with a new one more apt to rule in the new circumstances. Let us move on to the third important idea in Mosca, the idea that the ruling class has two distinct strata. No man rules alone, as they say, and any governing body is going to need an apparatus of people who fulfill the day-to-day functions of running the place, as well as an arguably even more important function, that of propagating the political formula. The first strata of the ruling class are simply those people who hold the positions of high office. It could be the king and his court of high-ranking nobles, or the prime minister, his cabinet and his party, but we can visibly see who is in charge. This is the highest stratum of the ruling class, but as Mosca outlines late in the second edition of The Ruling Class, in chapter 15. Below the highest stratum in the ruling class there is always, even in autocratic systems, another that is much more numerous and comprises all the capacities for leadership in the country. Without such a class any sort of social organization would be impossible. The higher stratum would not in itself be sufficient or leading and directing the activities of the masses. In the last analysis, therefore, the stability of any political organism depends on the level of morality, intelligence and activity that this second stratum has attained. Any intellectual or moral deficiencies in this second stratum, accordingly, represent a graver danger to the political structure, and one that is harder to repair, than the presence of similar deficiencies in the few dozen persons who control the workings of the state machine. We should note that Vilfredo Pareto also has these two categories, which he calls the governing elite and the non-governing elite. Pareto's treatise was published in 1916. This section from Mosca comes in the second part of the Elementi, which was added in 1923. Mosca acknowledges Pareto briefly in the introduction to this second part, which is significant as the two men were known not to get on. He also acknowledged him again in the final chapter of his History of Modern Political Doctrines published in 1933. This distinction between the two strata of the ruling class is one of the few places where we can trace the direct influence of Pareto on Mosca's thinking. The Italian Marxist theorist, Antonio Gramsci, was unhappy with the apparent vagueness in defining the ruling class this broadly, since the non-governing elite appears to encompass a broad section of society, if not the entire middle class. He declared that Mosca's political class is nothing but the intellectual section of the ruling group. Here, we must be careful. It seems to me that Mosca has in mind, principally, civil servants, bureaucrats, and other people responsible for the day-to-day management of the state. To use James Burnham's later phrase, he is thinking of the managerial class. Gramsci seems to have in mind the intelligentsia, those people responsible for disseminating and controlling the flow of information and ideas, opinion shapers, myth-makers, ideologists, upholders and justifiers of the political formula, or, if you prefer, a priest class. While this is certainly implied in the emphasis Mosca gives to the political formula, he does not explicitly stress these ideological functions of the non-governing elite, which were central to Gramsci's work. In fact, Gramsci's own theory of intellectuals is supposed to represent an improvement on Mosca's theory of the political class. Mosca, rather, stresses the practical considerations and deals with churches and religions in a separate chapter, and seemingly in isolation. He argues that at certain times, ideologies can be mere pretexts to justify conflict. However, he acknowledges that universal religions such as Christianity or Islam can constitute a very close bond between most disparate peoples who differ widely in race and language. But by the same token, also act as estranging forces of great potency between populations that cherish different beliefs. Thus religious sentiments, in Mosca's view, can either be skin-deep and post-hoc rationalized or deeply held and either a force for uniting disparate people or sowing division within an otherwise homogeneous group. Such doctrines may or may not be utilized as part of a political formula, but it seems that Mosca sees religions functioning somewhat independently of the ruling class. And he gives special treatment to priests as a ruling class in theocratic states. I think it would be fair to say that the role of official state ideologue, which is to say, the people responsible for propagating the political formula and ensuring it is believed by the masses, is somewhat underdeveloped in Mosca. Marxists such as Antonio Gramsci and Louis Althusser took this a lot further, and the so-called Long March through the institutions of the left is largely a testament to their thinking. In the canon of elite theory, the understanding of the role of intellectuals in the ruling class is greatly expanded by James Burnham and his protégé Samuel T. Francis, whom we will consider in later chapters. A fourth distinctive feature of Mosca's analysis is his concept of a level of civilization. In his introduction to the English version of the ruling class, Arthur Livingston provides a description of what Mosca means by this. It is a criterion that is definable to a high grade of approximation as multiplicity of activities, grade or quality of achievement in each, size and stability of social cohesion and, therefore, offensive and defensive power, standard of living and distribution of wealth, control of nature and utilization of that control, and so on even to the higher things themselves. In material economic terms, we might say that when Mosca talks about a high level of civilization, he is describing a very complex society with advanced division of labor, which affords both material prosperity and technological progress. However, as societies advance to higher levels, a robust bureaucracy becomes a raw practical necessity simply to manage the administration of so many people. Thus, Mosca identifies two key forms of social system, feudal and bureaucratic. In a feudal state, there are no separation of powers. The economic, the judicial, the administrative, the military functions of the ruling class are exercised simultaneously by the same individuals. These powers are vested in a local lord in a decentralized system of hierarchical patronage headed by a king. This has the advantage of a high level of social cohesion at the local level. Mosca points out that lords and their vassals were close in sentiment and manners. The baron knew his vassals personally. He thought and felt as they did. He had the same superstitions, the same habits, the same language. He was a man whom they understood perfectly, with whom they sometimes got drunk. However, feudal states are inefficient at quickly mobilizing men for military campaigns and are subject to internal quarrels between rival lords. In contrast, the bureaucratic state, which has succeeded in centralizing taxation, has greater specialization of the key functions of government and can maintain a standing army. Mosca says, the greater the number of officials who perform public duties and receive their salaries from the central government or from its local agencies, the more bureaucratic the state. The key marker of a bureaucratic state is not the fact of centralization, since many of these functions could be performed by private enterprise, but rather that they are performed by salaried employees and separated out into specialisms. In this respect, 1930s USA, the UK of the same era, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, the USSR, were all equally bureaucratic states. However, in Mosca's estimation, a further ethical criterion must be considered when judging that level of civilization, juridical defense. He explains, in a highly developed civilization not only do moral instincts, and for that matter selfish passions, become more refined, more conscious, more perfect. In a society in which political organization has made great progress, moral discipline is itself unquestionably greater, and the two selfish acts that are inhibited, or obstructed, by the reciprocal surveillance and restraint of the individuals who compose the society are more numerous and more clearly defined. This is somewhat different from saying that the more bureaucratic a society becomes, the higher its level, since one might easily imagine a bureaucratic state that has poor juridical defense. Mosca has in mind an independent and fair judiciary backed by strong rule of law which will, in turn, help to maintain a morally upstanding and law-abiding citizenry. If the ruling class keep political prisoners and act in an arbitrary manner, do not give the ruled the right to a fair trial, do not persecute serious crimes and let criminals loose on the streets, and so on, then it is evidence of a lack of juridical defense. Samuel T. Francis coined the phrase anarcho-tyranny in 2004 to describe the situation in which a highly bureaucratic and modern system such as the USA or the UK today could fail in meeting the basic standards of juridical defense. Juridical defense could only be maintained, according to Mosca, if there were independent competing power centers in society that were kept from converging. In effect, inter-elite competition would keep the central institutions more honest, which is easier said than done, as we shall see when we come to consider later thinkers. Mosca's The Ruling Class is a book with many fascinating insights and nuggets of political wisdom from its author as he navigates his way through many moments in history. He is almost impressionistic. What he lost in logical rigor was amply compensated for by the flexibility and richness of his analysis of political life. For us today it is an invaluable guide for two chief reasons. First, it punctures absolutely what I would like to call the populist delusion that if conditions get bad enough, if the plebeians become too disgruntled with their leaders, then the people will rise up and overthrow them. This, as Mosca shows, has never happened in history, not even once. This brings us to the second key practical use of his work, that if people want change even at a time of popular and widespread resentment of the ruling class, they can only hope to achieve that change by becoming a tightly knit and organized minority themselves and, in effect, displacing the old ruling class. This, of course, is no easy process, and Mosca was not in the business of outlining what needed to be done. He was the detached political scientist, not Vladimir Lenin. He is also vague as to the precise mechanisms that might lead to the replacement of one ruling class with another. How can a new ruling class propagate a political formula more apt to the circumstances than the old one, for example? Mosca's analysis is pitched at a panoramic level of remove, and so the business of political change seems almost automatic. It will be up to some of the other thinkers whom I will be considering in this book to fill in some of these gaps.